When a user asks a question, the system doesn't just see the data, it understands what those concepts mean. Instead of just responding to questions, agents will start, anticipating needs before the user even asks.
What happens to the human role?
Yeah, that's a very fair, the question.
Welcome to AI Wizards, an Orbite by SDG Group space for exploring what's behind the magic of artificial intelligence. Today, we're exploring a topic getting a lot of attention right now, agentic conversational business analytics. To help us do that, I'm joined by our subject matter expert, Mustafa Yagmur. As an AI and ML solutions architect at SDG Group, he's been working closely in this space, designing and implementing solutions for a wide range of applications. Mustafa, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Stella. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So jumping into our discussion, for many watching, terms like agentic AI or conversational analytics might sound abstract or even like buzzwords. We want to break these down in a practical way. So how would you go about explaining this to someone in business who's maybe not deeply technical? And what makes it different from platforms that they're already familiar with, like AI chatbots or BI tools?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I like actually how you framed it because, it sounds like a bit, complex at first, but the idea is actually quite intuitive when you break it down. It simply offers you the chance to talk to your data with agents. That is the whole idea, I think. At a high level, it's about moving, from traditional, the static dashboards to intelligent systems that, can actually think, like reason, act. If you look at the traditional BI, it is mostly dashboards. You explore data yourself and try to extract insights. Then came this, the conversational tools like chatbots, which made it easier to ask questions. But those are still quite limited, and they can answer queries, but they don't really understand the deep business context, and they don't go much beyond the exact the question you ask. So, but the agentic analytics is fundamentally, different. On top, there's, you have a chat interface still, for conversational experience, and this, could be text or voice or both. But in the middle, there's this, embedded business knowledge, which is this KPIs, metrics, business rules, logic. And at the bottom, the data, the structured could be also unstructured as well. So when user is asking a question, the agents actually act more like a business analyst or domain expert. The agents can go into structured data, look at it and then combine with the unstructured data sources. And if needed, interpret results, reason through them, and then bring back a meaningful, contextualized answer to the user. So in practice, you can ask a business question in your domain, just like you would ask to an expert or your colleague, but the agents will go find, analyze, and synthesize, all the information for you. So that is what it makes so powerful. I think it's not just answering, it is doing also the work behind the scene, everything for you.
So you've touched on how things are changing. I'd like to explore that a bit more. Organizations have been using traditional BI tools for years, like dashboards, reports, semantic models, and the like. From your perspective, what's really changing now? And why do you see this shift towards agentic analytics as such a significant step forward?
Yeah. So that's a great question, I think. The key point is that I think this is not just an incremental improvement. It is really a shift in how we interact with the data. So in traditional BI, organizations already had strong foundations like data platforms, dashboards, even like semantic layers to define business, metrics and logic. But accessing insights still required effort, right? So business users had to navigate to dashboards, interpret the data themselves, or depend on the other the analysts or their colleagues to answer more complex questions. So even though the data and business logic are there, the actual process of getting insights are still quite manual, like fragmented and time consuming, basically. So now what is changing with agentic analytics is that we are essentially embedding that analytical expertise directly into the agentic systems. So instead of users doing the analysis or relying on someone else to do it, they can interact directly with the agents that already understand the business context. So, and like KPI tools and etc. And so you're no longer exploring dashboards or asking business questions. And what is different now is that we can combine that conversational experience with deep business knowledge and reasoning capabilities.
Got it. So you've mentioned the term agentic a few times now, and it seems to be a really key part of this whole shift. So maybe we can unpack that a little bit more. What would you say it actually means for a system to be agentic? And what's happening behind the scenes that makes these systems behave so differently from traditional tools?
Yeah, of course. So that's a really key question. So at a simple level, the system is not just responding, but actually, taking responsibility for solving a problem. This is, I think, the whole idea about it being agentic. So in traditional BI tools, or even like basic AI chatbots like ChatGPT or the Gemini, etc., you ask something and you get the response very quick. So this system doesn't go beyond, right? So with agentic analytics, as agents, the system is designed to take a goal, like a business question, and then they figure out how to get to the answer. And to do that, it uses agents like that already have business knowledge embedded in them, like this KPIs, logics, relationships, like business context. So when a question comes in, the agent doesn't look for a direct answer. It will break down the problem and decide what data it needs and access different sources like structured or unstructured data or other external data sources, and analyze that information, then synthesize a meaningful response. So in many cases, there isn't really just one agent either. You can have multiple agents working together, and each with a specific task or role, and collaborating to solve the problem end to end. So that's what really changes the behavior. Instead of a tool that waits for instructions step by step, you have a system that can plan, reason, execute, very similar to how a business analyst would approach a question. And that is why the experience feels so different. You are no longer guiding the system, you're giving it a goal, and it takes care of the analytical work behind the scenes.
So you've mentioned the semantic layer a few times now, and it clearly seems to play a very central role in everything that you're describing. For someone who might not be familiar with that concept, or who might think of it as just another technical layer, why is it actually so critical in this new approach? And what would break or be missing if that semantic layer wasn't there?
Yeah, that's I think a very critical, great question. So because it is easy to underestimate how important it is. At the end of the day, the data is actually out there, but it doesn't carry really any meaning. So it's just the numbers and tables, and unless you understand the business context behind it. So in traditional systems, semantic layers already existed for many years, but they were mostly focused on the structuring the data, like defining metrics, dimensions, like some basic logic. In agentic systems, the semantic layer becomes more like a contextual knowledge layer. So it is like an entire human analyst package. So it doesn't only understand the KPIs, metrics like in traditional semantic layers, but also knows well about the business, like business strategies, goals, like rules, logic, like trends, whatever the business, the domain expert is it is. So, and this is what allows the agents to behave like a context-aware domain experts. So, because like when a user asks a question, the system doesn't just see the data, it understands what those concepts mean in that specific business domain. Without that, the system would be generic, like inconsistent. So with it, you get reliable, aligned, trustworthy insights. So in a way, like contextual knowledge layer is what transforms raw data into usable business knowledge in agentic analytics. I think that is like all this story about having this contextual semantic layer.
Okay, so one thing that often comes up when we talk about AI in general, and especially systems that can reason and recommend actions, is trust. If these systems are going to play a role in decision-making, businesses need to be confident in the outputs. I think that's a given. How do you ensure that what these agentic systems produce is actually reliable, accurate, and truly aligned with the business?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is so critical, like similar to semantic layer, because no matter how powerful the technology is, if users don't trust the output, they just won't use it, right? So this is basically one of the main blockers in user adoption as well. So from the beginning, the trust has to be designed into the system. So it's not something you add later, right? So there are a few key aspects to that. Firstly, it starts with the foundation, the fact that these agents are built on top of a well-defined semantic layer with all these like business context and logic. So the system is not generating answers in isolation, right? So it is grounded in the same definitions and rules the business already trusts. So secondly, we need these strong validation mechanisms that includes like things like predefined golden questions, some evaluation, the approaches and frameworks, and continuous testing to make sure the system behaves correctly across the different scenarios, right? So the third is transparency is very important. The system should be able to explain how it arrived at an answer, what data it used, right? So what logic was applied, and so users can understand and verify the results if needed. And finally, the governance plays a big role. The agents need to have clearly defined roles, access boundaries, and controls, just like users, in an organization. So in some cases, you also include human in the loop steps, especially for more sensitive decisions. Overall, it is a combination of strong foundations, continuous validation, transparency, governance that allows you to build that trust. And once that trust is there, I think that's when you really start to see adoption at scale.
So something else you mentioned earlier really caught my attention. You talked about moving from insights to action. And I think a lot of organizations would say, well, we already have insights, we have dashboards, reports, and so on. So what is really different here? What does it mean in a practical sense to go beyond insights and actually move into action?
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. Traditionally, the analytics, has done a good job at, providing insights for many years, and showing what happened, sometimes even why it happened. But then the process usually stops there. The responsibility of deciding what to do next is still on the user, right? The decision making. So, and what agentic analytics enables is going one step further, right? Since the system already understands the data and the business logic and context, it can also help answer questions like, what should I do next? Or what are my options? So instead of just presenting information there, it can suggest you action items, highlight risks, even simulate some potential outcomes. In practice, that means the user is not just receiving insights, they are getting guidance, and they're I think this is a very big shift. So because it turns analytics from something you look at, into something that you actively helps you make decisions. So it's just, turning the insights into decisions.
Got it. So this all sounds very promising, and I'm sure a lot of organizations are interested in moving in this direction. So in reality, adopting something like this seems like it's rarely straightforward, though. So from what you've seen, where do companies typically struggle? What are the main challenges that they face when trying to move towards this kind of agentic approach in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important to be realistic about that. So one of the biggest challenges is moving from a proof of concept to something that actually works live in production, right? So it is relatively easy today to build something that looks good, very good, in a demo, but making it consistent, scalable, and trustworthy, we talk about all this in a real business environment is a whole different, the complexity. So another challenge is around the data and the business alignment. If the data isn't well structured, or the business, even business definitions aren't clearly agreed upon, the system won't produce, the consistent results. That's why the semantic layer is so critical. It brings that alignment. There is also governance. So since these systems can reason and recommend actions, organizations need to ensure the proper controls, what agents can access, what they can do, and how decisions are validated. And finally, there's a human aspect. This changes how people interact with data. So building trust and helping users adopt this new way of working is, I think, key. So, but once these pieces are in place, the value becomes very clear, I think. So an adoption tends to accelerate quickly.
Okay, so you've talked a lot about agents and intelligence, but I imagine none of this works without the right foundations, right? So what role do data and strategy play in making these systems successful?
Yeah, they're absolutely fundamental. So there is a simple principle we always, come back to. There is no AI strategy without a data strategy. So if your data isn't well structured, governed, aligned with the business definitions, then even the most advanced technology won't deliver reliable results at all. That is why the foundation, the data layer, semantic layer, and also overall architecture is so critical. Beyond data, strategy is also, just as important as data. So organizations need to be clear on where value comes from, which use cases matter, and how these systems integrate into their processes. So agentic analytics works best when it is a part of a broader platform approach, not just isolated experiments. So that is, I think, what ensures the long-term value and scalability for the businesses.
So looking ahead a bit, because the space is clearly evolving very, very quickly, where do you see this going next? If we think about, the next few years, how do you expect agentic analytics to evolve, and what kind of impact do you think it'll have on how businesses operate?
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting space. I think, we are still at a relatively, the early stage of what's possible. Right now, we are already seeing a big shift from users exploring data themselves into interacting with systems that can analyze and guide them. But looking ahead, I think these systems will become even more proactive and integrated into their daily workflows. So instead of just responding to questions, agents will start anticipating needs, surfacing the insights automatically and highlighting risks and suggesting actions before the user even asks. So we'll also see deeper integration with business processes. So it won't just be about insights and recommendations, but actually connecting those insights to execution, like triggering like some workflows, automating like certain decisions, or collaborating with other systems internally. Another important, the direction is continuous learning. So these agents will improve over time, like learning from user interactions, feedback, and new data. So they become more aligned with how the business operates. Overall, I think the biggest impact will be how decisions are made. So we'll move toward a model where, every business user has access to something like a domain expert, available instantly, and able to analyze complex situations and support decision making in real time. So analytics, ultimately becomes like less about tools and more about having an intelligent layer embedded across the organization. And I think this really becomes the transformative the technology.
So with all of this automation and intelligence, a natural question comes up, I think. What happens to the human role? If agents are doing analysis and even suggesting actions, where do people fit in?
Yeah, that's a very fair, the question. And I think, it's often like misunderstood. The goal, I think, is not to replace human decision making at all, but enhance it, augment it. So agents are very good at processing, the large amounts of data, identifying patterns, like generating insights. But humans bring something different, I think, which is the contextual judgment, experience, like ability to interpret situations beyond the data. So what we are moving toward is a collaborative model. So the agents acts like an expert assistant, providing analysis scenarios and recommendations, while the human remains like responsible for the final decision. So that is why concepts like human in the loop are, I think, like so important. So in the end, it's about like combining machine intelligence with the human judgment, human intelligence to make like better, like faster and reliable decisions.
So at SDG and within our Orbite space, innovation has always been a core pillar. So to make this more concrete, can you tell us a little more about what we're currently building in this space, especially around agentic analytics, and what clients can expect from us moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is like something we are really actively, building, spending a lot of effort on this, not just, discussing. So we have developed our own agentic analytics solution internally. The name is Insights Gen, we call it, and built around this domain-aware agents and that understands, business context, like work across this structured, unstructured, the data, and deliver like insights, root causes, and recommendations. It is also highly adaptable. Like we tailor it to each client industry, like data landscape and the needs. At the same time, we also build directly on client platforms like Azure, Snowflake, Databricks, or like Click, AWS, GCP. So we are fully platform agnostic.
That's really insightful. So before we wrap up, if there's one key takeaway for business leaders, what would it be?
Yeah, so I would say it is not just about adopting new tools. I think it's more like about rethinking how we work with data and make decisions. Agentic analytics makes business knowledge instantly accessible. I think we all aware of this. So the real advantage comes from, I think, turning data into decisions quickly and consistently. So that requires the right foundations, but also the right mindset, right? So because ultimately it's about helping people make better decisions and faster and reliable.
It's a great takeaway. So thank you so much for sharing your insights, and thanks to everyone for joining us. We will see you next time.
Thank you.